Andrew Collins had everything: wealth, power, control. Nothing in his life happened without his permission. Until the day his ex showed up unannounced, her eyes filled with fear, and said the words that shattered his world. "Your daughter is in the hospital." He didn't have a daughter. At least, that's what he had always believed. But as the truth unraveled, one thing became terrifyingly clear: he was already 5 years too late. Andrew Collins had spent years building a life where surprises didn't exist. His days were carefully planned, his time meticulously managed, and his focus never wavered from the empire he had created. As the CEO of Collins Enterprises, he had everything a man could want: wealth, power, and absolute control. His world operated like a well-oiled machine, and there was no room for unexpected disruptions. That was why, when he stepped out of his office that evening, he wasn't prepared for what was waiting for him. The moment he saw her, something in his chest tightened. Sophie Reeves stood near the entrance of his building, her dark brown hair slightly tousled by the wind, her arms crossed over her chest. There was something different about her, something in her posture, in the way she was gripping the strap of her bag so tightly, as if she were holding herself together. For a second, Andrew considered walking past her, pretending not to notice. It had been 5 years since they had spoken, 5 years since he had walked away from whatever it was they had shared. It hadn't been love, not in the way she had wanted it to be. At least, that's what he had told himself back then. He sighed, pushing away the irritation creeping into his voice. "Sophie." Her dark eyes flicked up to meet his, and the instant he saw the emotion in them, he knew something was wrong. Sophie was many things, but she wasn't the kind of woman who came running back to the past without a reason. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was something fragile underneath it, something that sent a strange feeling through him. Andrew checked his watch. He had a dinner meeting in 20 minutes, a deal worth millions on the line. He didn't have time for this. "I'm busy," he said, keeping his tone firm but not unkind. "If this is about the past, Sophie, I don't think there's anything left to." "It's not about us," she interrupted, and for the first time, he noticed the way her hands were trembling. "It's about my daughter." Something in the way she said it made his stomach tighten. He wasn't sure why. "Your daughter," he repeated, his brows drawing together. "I didn't know you had a kid." Sophie swallowed hard, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. It was the first time he had ever seen her look nervous. Sophie had always been confident, sharp-tongued, and unshaken, even in the worst of situations. But now, she looked as if she was barely holding herself together. "She's 5, Sophie said, her voice quieter now. "And she's in the hospital." Andrew felt the first flicker of something uneasy crawl down his spine, but he forced himself to stay composed. "I'm sorry to hear that, but I don't understand what this has to do with me." Sophie inhaled sharply, and when she looked at him again, he saw it, the hesitation, the fear, the moment she decided to say the words that would change everything. "She's your daughter, Andrew." The world seemed to tilt for a moment. The sounds of the city faded, the movement of people walking past became a blur. His mind refused to process what she had just said. He stared at her, searching her face for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke. But there was nothing. Only truth. His throat felt dry. "That's not possible." Sophie's eyes flashed with something sharp. "It is. And I wouldn't be here if I had any other choice." Andrew took a step back, shaking his head. His entire life had been built on certainty, on logic, on knowing exactly what was coming next. This was impossible. "You should have told me," he said, his voice colder than he intended. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "And what would you have done, Andrew? 5 years ago, you told me there was no room in your life for a family. You made your choice. And I made mine." He didn't have an answer to that. Because she wasn't wrong. But none of that mattered anymore. Because somewhere in a hospital room, there was a little girl. His daughter. And for the first time in his life, Andrew Collins didn't know what to do next. Andrew Collins had always been a man who thrived on control. Every decision he made, every risk he took, was calculated down to the finest detail. He never walked into a negotiation unprepared. He never allowed emotion to cloud his judgment. But standing in front of Sophie Reeves, hearing her say the words that had just shattered the foundation of his carefully built life, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. His daughter. The words echoed in his mind, but they still didn't feel real. He searched Sophie's face for any sign of deception, any indication that this was some kind of cruel manipulation, but there was nothing but truth in her dark eyes. Truth and something else. Something desperate. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to focus. If this is true, why are you telling me now? Why after 5 years? Sophie's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. Because I don't have a choice anymore. Andrew's jaw clenched. He didn't like the sound of that. What do you mean? She hesitated for half a second, but that was all it took for him to see it, the fear she was trying to keep buried. Sophie wasn't the kind of woman who scared easily. When they had been together, she had always been strong, independent, unwilling to show weakness. But right now, she looked like she was barely holding herself together. She inhaled sharply. Lily's sick, Andrew. It's her heart. His stomach twisted at the name. Lily. His daughter. He ran a hand over his face, trying to ground himself. How bad is it? Sophie swallowed, and in that moment, he knew. It was worse than he wanted to believe. She needs surgery, she said finally. A serious one. The doctors say she has a good chance, but there are risks. And she's scared. She keeps asking for her dad. Andrew's chest tightened. He had spent years avoiding attachments, keeping his life streamlined, focused, free of distractions. He had convinced himself that relationships, real relationships, weren't worth the complications. But none of that mattered now. Why didn't you tell me before? His voice was quieter now, the edge of anger dulled by something heavier. Sophie let out a soft, bitter laugh. And what would you have done, Andrew? 5 years ago, you were obsessed with your company, with your next big deal. You told me you didn't believe in love, that family wasn't part of your plan. Do you really think you would have dropped everything for a child you didn't even want? Andrew didn't have an answer. Because the truth was, she was probably right. But that didn't change the fact that he should have known. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. I want to see her. Sophie's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Are you sure? The question hit him harder than he expected. Was he sure? No. Nothing about this was certain. Nothing about this fit into the structured world he had built for himself. But he knew one thing for sure. He had already missed 5 years of his daughter's life. He wasn't going to miss another second. I'm sure, he said. Take me to her. Sophie studied him for a long moment, as if searching for any sign that he would back out. Then she nodded. Okay. Andrew exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had faced the toughest businessmen in the world, negotiated deals worth billions, stood in front of rooms full of people expecting him to be the smartest man there. But as he followed Sophie out of the building, stepping into the unknown, he realized something terrifying. For the first time in his life, he had no idea what came next. The drive to the hospital was quiet, filled with a tension that neither Andrew nor Sophie attempted to break. The city lights blurred past the windows, but Andrew barely noticed them. His mind was too consumed by what was ahead of him. He had walked into countless high-stakes meetings, stood before some of the most powerful men in the world, and never once had he felt the kind of uncertainty pressing down on him now. Sophie sat beside him, staring straight ahead, her hands clenched in her lap. Every so often, he saw her fingers twitch, as if she wanted to say something but thought better of it. He didn't push. He wasn't sure he wanted to hear anything else until he saw the truth with his own eyes. When they pulled into the hospital parking lot, Sophie finally turned to him. Her expression was guarded, but beneath it, he could see exhaustion. "She doesn't know you're coming," she said. Andrew nodded, unbuckling his seatbelt. "How much does she know about me?" Sophie hesitated. "I told her about you in the way a child would understand. She knows your name. She knows that you weren't around but that it wasn't because you didn't care. I never wanted her to think she wasn't wanted." Her words stung more than he expected. He wasn't sure if it was because she had tried to protect him in his absence or because he knew deep down that his absence was the result of his own choices, even if he hadn't been aware of them. Sophie got out of the car, and he followed, his steps slower than usual. He wasn't sure why his body felt heavier with every step he took toward the hospital doors. Inside, the hallways were sterile and quiet, filled with the faint sounds of beeping monitors and distant murmurs of nurses and doctors moving between rooms. The smell of antiseptic and something faintly metallic filled the air. Andrew had always hated hospitals. They had a way of making even the most powerful men feel small. Sophie led him down the hall, stopping in front of a door with a small nameplate that simply read Lily Reeves. Andrew's throat tightened at the sight of it. Sophie turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Are you ready?" No. He wasn't. But he nodded anyway. She pushed open the door, stepping inside first, and he followed, his heart pounding harder than it ever had in his life. The room was small, softly lit, with a single hospital bed in the center. And in that bed, curled up beneath a pale blue blanket, was a little girl. Andrew's breath caught in his throat. She was so small. Her dark brown hair was slightly messy, curling at the ends, and her face was pale against the stark whiteness of the pillow. She looked fragile, like she could disappear if he blinked. But it wasn't just her size or the machines around her that made his chest tighten. It was her eyes. The moment they fluttered open, sleepy and hazy from rest, they locked onto him. Bright, crystal blue. His blue. The same shade he saw in the mirror every morning. His legs felt rooted to the floor, his pulse hammering in his ears. Lily blinked at him, then turned her gaze to Sophie, her small voice soft but curious. "Mommy, who's that?" Sophie glanced at Andrew, giving him the space to answer. He forced himself to take a step closer, his voice quieter than it had ever been. "Hi, Lily." He swallowed hard. "I'm your dad." For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Lily's little brows furrowed, as if she were processing the words. Then, to his absolute shock, a tiny smile appeared on her lips. "You're real." Andrew let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "I'm real." Lily looked up at Sophie as if confirming it for herself. Sophie nodded gently, her expression unreadable. Lily turned back to Andrew, studying him for a long moment. "You look like me." A strange mix of emotions swelled in his chest, threatening to crush him. He had spent his whole life building a legacy, a reputation, an empire. But nothing had ever struck him as deeply as those 4 simple words. He took another step forward, hesitating before reaching for her tiny hand resting on the blanket. His fingers barely brushed against hers, but the moment their skin touched, something inside him shifted. "I guess I do," he murmured. Lily yawned, her eyes already growing heavy again. But before she drifted off, she gave his fingers a tiny squeeze. "You stayed," she mumbled sleepily. Andrew swallowed hard. "I did." As her breathing evened out, he stayed there, holding her hand, watching her sleep. And for the first time in his life, nothing else in the world mattered. Andrew sat beside Lily's bed for what felt like hours, unable to take his eyes off her. Every slow rise and fall of her small chest made something inside him tighten. She looked peaceful in sleep, but the reality of where they were, the machines around her, and the quiet hum of the hospital reminded him that this wasn't just a normal father-daughter introduction. This was a hospital room. His daughter was sick. And he hadn't even known she existed. Sophie sat across from him, her arms crossed over her chest, watching him carefully. He could feel her gaze on him, assessing, waiting. She had every right to be wary. He hadn't earned his place here. He hadn't earned anything when it came to Lily. After a long silence, Sophie spoke, her voice quieter than usual. "You don't have to stay." Andrew looked up sharply. "I'm not leaving." Sophie sighed, rubbing her temple. "I'm not saying you have to walk away forever. I just know this is a lot to process. And I don't expect you to suddenly." "I'm not leaving," he repeated, his tone firmer this time. Something flickered in her expression, something she quickly hid. "Okay." Andrew turned back to Lily, watching as she stirred slightly in her sleep. His mind was racing with too many thoughts, too many questions. He didn't even know where to begin. Finally, he forced himself to ask the one question he dreaded most. "How bad is it?" Sophie's posture stiffened. "The doctors say she has a congenital heart condition. It's been manageable until now, but her condition has worsened. She needs surgery. Soon." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His daughter needed surgery, and he hadn't even known she existed until today. He had missed so much. He had missed everything. He clenched his jaw, trying to steady himself. "Is she in pain?" Sophie hesitated before shaking her head. "Not all the time. Some days are worse than others. She gets tired easily. Her heart has to work harder than it should." Andrew swallowed hard, gripping the armrest of the chair beside the bed. "And the surgery? What are the risks?" Sophie's face paled slightly, and for the first time, he saw something in her that unnerved him. Fear. "There are always risks. But the doctors say she has a good chance. If we do this soon, she has a future." The word hit him in a way he wasn't expecting. Future. A future he hadn't even known existed until today. A future that depended on something he had no control over. Andrew had spent his entire life in control. He didn't know how to handle this feeling of complete helplessness. Sophie shifted in her chair, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her jeans. "The surgery is expensive." Andrew snapped his gaze to her. "Money isn't an issue." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I'm not asking you for money, Andrew." He narrowed his eyes. "Then why did you come to me now?" Sophie let out a slow breath, and when she looked at him, her dark eyes held something raw, something he wasn't prepared for. "Because she asked for you." Andrew felt something inside him crack. "She didn't even know me." "She knew of you," Sophie corrected. "I told her stories, little things. I never wanted her to feel like she was missing something. But when she got sick, when she got scared, she wanted to meet you." Andrew couldn't breathe for a moment. His daughter had wanted him. She had asked for him. And he hadn't even known. He looked back at Lily, at the tiny fingers curled around the edge of her blanket. He could still feel the warmth of her small hand from earlier, the way she had squeezed his fingers before drifting off to sleep. He had spent years telling himself that family wasn't in his plans. That love, relationships, children, none of it fit into the life he had built. But now, staring at the little girl who shared his eyes, the little girl who had been fighting a battle he hadn't even known about, he realized how wrong he had been. He had already missed 5 years. He wouldn't miss another second. He turned back to Sophie, his voice steady, his decision made. "Tell me everything I need to know. I'm not going anywhere." Andrew had always been a man of action. When faced with a problem, he found a solution. When obstacles appeared, he removed them. His world was built on control, logic, and decisive action. But nothing about this situation was in his control. Nothing about this moment allowed for a clean, strategic solution. For the first time in his life, he was completely powerless. He sat beside Lily's bed, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest as she slept. The machines monitoring her heartbeat beeped softly in the background, a constant reminder that time was not on their side. He had spent his entire life chasing numbers, profit margins, and power, but none of it mattered in this room. Here, the only thing that mattered was her. Sophie sat across from him, arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if trying to shield herself from the weight of the conversation they were about to have. He had told her to tell him everything. Now that she was ready to, he wasn't sure he wanted to hear it. She exhaled slowly, running a hand through her dark brown hair. The condition she has is called congenital heart disease. She was diagnosed when she was a baby. At first, it was mild. Something the doctors monitored but didn't think would become life-threatening. But over the past year, things changed. She started getting tired more easily. She would get dizzy, sometimes even collapse. I knew something was wrong, but I kept hoping the doctors would tell me it was just temporary. Andrew's jaw tightened as she spoke. He hated that she had gone through this alone. He hated that Lily had been fighting this battle without him even knowing she existed. Sophie continued, her voice quieter now. They told me a few months ago that she would need surgery. At first, I thought I could handle everything myself. I started working extra hours, saving everything I could, applying for financial assistance. But even with all that, it wasn't enough. And then, last week, Lily asked me something that changed everything. She hesitated, looking down at her hands as if the memory was too much. When she finally spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. She asked me if her daddy would come see her before she went to sleep forever. Andrew felt like the air had been ripped from his lungs. Sophie looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with something raw. That's when I knew I had to find you. Andrew clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms as a wave of emotions crashed over him. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to tell Sophie that she had no right to keep this from him, that he should have been there from the beginning. But none of that would change the past. None of it would fix what had already been done. Instead, he forced himself to focus on the present. What's the next step? Sophie blinked at him, as if she hadn't expected him to ask that question. The surgery is scheduled for next week. The doctors are optimistic, but there are risks. She'll need time to recover, and she'll have to be monitored closely for a while after. Andrew nodded, absorbing the information. I'll cover everything. Sophie's lips pressed into a thin line. I told you, I didn't come here for your money. He met her gaze evenly. And I told you, I'm not leaving. I don't care what you think this is about. She's my daughter, Sophie. I will do whatever it takes to make sure she gets the best care possible. She studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not she believed him. Finally, she sighed, nodding slightly. Okay. Silence settled between them, heavy but no longer hostile. For the first time since she had shown up at his office, they weren't fighting. They were just two parents trying to figure out how to help their child. Andrew leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze locked on Lily's sleeping face. Does she know? Sophie tilted her head slightly. Know what? He swallowed hard. That I wasn't there because I didn't know. That it wasn't my choice. Sophie hesitated. I never told her you left because I didn't want her to feel unwanted. I told her that sometimes daddies have to be far away, but that doesn't mean they don't care. She never hated you for not being here. She just wondered when you'd come. Andrew closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push past the guilt clawing at his chest. He had spent his whole life avoiding attachments, convincing himself that love and family were complications he didn't need. But sitting here now, he realized how wrong he had been. He opened his eyes, looking at Sophie. "I want her to know I'm staying." Sophie nodded. "Then prove it." Andrew didn't respond right away. He just reached for Lily's tiny hand, gently wrapping his fingers around hers. He had made billion-dollar deals, built an empire from nothing, and held power over thousands of people. But in this moment, sitting in a hospital room with a little girl who had no idea how much she had already changed his life, he realized that this was the most important thing he had ever done. He wasn't going anywhere. Andrew spent the next few days at the hospital, barely leaving Lily's side. He had cancelled every meeting, pushed aside every business obligation, and told his assistant to clear his schedule indefinitely. Nothing else mattered. The empire he had built, the wealth he had accumulated, the power he had spent years securing, it all felt meaningless compared to the tiny girl in the hospital bed, holding on to life with quiet strength he didn't know a child could have. Lily had woken up a few times, each moment pulling him deeper into something he wasn't prepared for. She would blink up at him with those same blue eyes he saw in the mirror every morning, offering him small, sleepy smiles as if he had always been there. She didn't look at him with anger or confusion. She wasn't scared of him. She accepted him without hesitation, as if she had been waiting for him all along. One afternoon, as he sat beside her bed, flipping through a children's book he had picked up from the hospital gift shop, she stirred and turned her head toward him. Her voice was small and tired but filled with curiosity. "Daddy, how come you didn't come sooner?" The question knocked the breath out of him. He looked at Sophie, who was sitting in the corner of the room, but she didn't interfere. This was his moment. He had to find the right words, even if he wasn't sure there were any that could make up for what had been lost. He set the book down, leaning forward slightly. "I didn't know about you, Lily." His voice was softer than it had ever been. "If I had, I would have been here." She seemed to think about that for a moment. Then she reached out, her small fingers brushing against his hand. "But you're here now." Andrew swallowed hard, his throat tight. He turned his palm up and let her tiny fingers curl into his. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm here now." She smiled, as if that was all she needed. Sophie let out a quiet breath from across the room, and for the first time in days, she didn't look like she was bracing for a fight. Later that evening, after Lily had fallen asleep again, Andrew stepped out into the hallway. He ran a hand through his hair, taking a slow, steadying breath. He hadn't allowed himself to fully process everything yet. Every moment since Sophie had appeared in his office had been a whirlwind, pushing him forward before he could make sense of the weight of it all. Sophie joined him outside the room, crossing her arms over her chest. "She really likes you," she said quietly. Andrew let out a small, humorless chuckle. "That makes one of us." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "You don't like yourself?" He looked away, jaw tightening. "I don't like that I missed 5 years of her life. I don't like that she was here, getting sicker, while I was out there thinking I had everything I needed. I don't like that I was so blind." Sophie sighed, rubbing her temple. "Andrew," she hesitated. "You can't change the past." He turned to face her, his blue eyes sharp. "But you could have." Her expression hardened. "And what would you have done if I had told you back then? You weren't exactly the family type." He opened his mouth, ready to argue, but the words didn't come. She was right. If she had told him back then, would he have been ready? Would he have walked away? He hated the thought, but he didn't know the answer. Sophie softened slightly, her voice losing its edge. "I didn't tell you to hurt you. I told you now because she asked for you. Because I saw the way she looked at me, hoping I would say yes when she asked if you'd ever come." Andrew closed his eyes for a brief second, letting that sink in. He had never been needed before. People respected him, feared him, depended on him in business, but no one had ever needed him like this. He turned back to Sophie, his voice steady. "I'm not leaving her." Sophie studied him for a long moment before nodding. Good. They stood in silence for a while, the weight of everything heavy between them. Andrew had walked into this hospital as a man who had thought he had control over his life. Now, he understood that control had always been an illusion. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing power, success, or money. He was standing still, holding on to something far more important. And he wasn't letting go. The night before Lily's surgery was the longest of Andrew's life. He had faced high-stakes negotiations, billion-dollar deals, and ruthless competitors, but nothing had ever made him feel as helpless as watching his daughter sleep, knowing that in just a few hours, she would be on an operating table, fighting for her life. He sat in the chair beside her bed, his fingers lightly wrapped around her small hand. The monitors beeped in a steady rhythm, a sound that had become both comforting and terrifying over the past few days. Sophie sat on the other side of the bed, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were trying to hold herself together. They had barely spoken in the last hour. Words felt useless. There was nothing left to say that could ease the weight pressing down on both of them. At one point, Lily stirred, her eyelids fluttering open as she let out a soft, sleepy sigh. Her blue eyes found his in the dim light of the room, and she gave him a small, drowsy smile. "Daddy, you're still here." His throat tightened, but he forced himself to smile. "Of course, sweetheart. I'm not going anywhere." She let out a tiny yawn and blinked up at him. "Are you scared?" Andrew wasn't sure how to answer that. He had spent his whole life pretending fear didn't exist. Fear was weakness. Fear was something he crushed before it had a chance to take hold. But right now, looking at his daughter, fear was the only thing he could feel. He squeezed her hand gently. "I just want you to be okay." Lily studied him for a moment, then whispered, "I will be." The certainty in her voice made something deep inside him ache. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't doubting anything. She believed she would be fine, and she believed that he would be here when she woke up. He had never been someone's source of comfort before. He had never been someone's safe place. But Lily had already decided that he was. She gave his hand a small squeeze. "Can you tell me a story?" Andrew glanced at Sophie, who met his gaze with tired eyes. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. This was his moment. He turned back to Lily, clearing his throat slightly. "Okay. Let's see." He had never been good at telling stories, but he forced himself to think. Once upon a time, there was a very strong little girl. She was braver than knights and smarter than wizards. And one day, she had to go on a very important adventure. Lily's eyelids were already growing heavy again, but she was listening. What kind of adventure? Andrew brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. A journey to make her heart even stronger. She had lots of people who loved her, and they would all be waiting for her when she got back. Lily smiled sleepily. "Like you?" His chest ached, and he nodded. "Yeah, baby girl. Like me." She exhaled softly, her grip on his hand loosening as she drifted back into sleep. Andrew didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was, watching her, memorizing every little breath, every small twitch of her fingers. He couldn't stop thinking about how much he had already missed. Her first words. Her first steps. The way she had probably looked up at Sophie 1,000 times over the years and asked when she would get to meet her dad. Sophie shifted slightly in her chair, letting out a quiet sigh. "You should try to rest." Andrew shook his head. "I can't." She didn't argue. She understood. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything they had been through hanging between them. Finally, Sophie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "She really believes in you." Andrew swallowed hard. "I don't want to let her down." Sophie looked at him, something unreadable in her expression. "Then don't." Andrew held his daughter's hand a little tighter. He had spent his whole life chasing things that never really mattered. But right here, in this quiet hospital room, with his daughter curled up beside him and Sophie sitting across from him, he finally understood what did matter. And he wasn't going to lose it. The morning of the surgery arrived too quickly. The hours had passed in a blur, and before Andrew was ready, the nurses were coming in, preparing Lily to be taken to the operating room. He had spent the night sitting in the chair beside her bed, holding her hand even while she slept, afraid to let go. Sophie had dozed off in the corner of the room for a few hours, but the second the door opened that morning, she was wide awake, standing at Lily's side. Lily, still groggy from sleep, rubbed her eyes and looked up at them with a small, sleepy smile. "Is it time?" Andrew forced himself to smile back, even though every part of him wanted to say no. "Yeah, sweetheart. It's time." She reached for his hand, and he took it, wrapping his fingers gently around hers. "Will you be here when I wake up?" His throat felt tight, but he nodded. "I'll be right here." Sophie leaned down, brushing Lily's hair back. "So will I, baby." Lily yawned and gave them both a drowsy smile. "Okay." A few minutes later, the nurses arrived with the stretcher. Andrew stepped back, feeling his chest tighten as they gently lifted Lily and placed her onto it. Her tiny frame looked even smaller surrounded by all the medical equipment. He hated this. He hated that he couldn't do anything. He had spent his entire life fixing problems, but this was something he couldn't fix. As they wheeled her toward the door, Lily turned her head and looked back at them. "Love you, Mommy. Love you, Daddy." Andrew had never heard those words before. Not from her. They hit him like a tidal wave, crashing over him with a force he hadn't been prepared for. He felt his control slipping, but he didn't care. He leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I love you too, baby girl." Sophie sniffled and kissed her hand. "We love you so much." Lily gave them one last sleepy smile before the nurses wheeled her out of the room. The second she was gone, Andrew felt the weight of the moment slam into him. The walls of control he had spent years building cracked under the pressure, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt completely, utterly powerless. Sophie stood beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring at the door as if willing Lily to come right back. Andrew didn't think. He just reached out and took her hand, gripping it tightly. She didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled around his, holding on just as desperately as he was. Hours passed in agonizing silence. Andrew couldn't sit still. He paced the waiting room, unable to focus on anything except the endless ticking of the clock. Sophie sat in one of the chairs, her knee bouncing anxiously. Neither of them spoke much. There was nothing to say. The only thing that mattered was what was happening on the other side of those doors. Every time a doctor or nurse walked past, Andrew's heart clenched, fearing the worst. He had spent his entire life thinking he was untouchable, that nothing could shake him. But this had shaken him to his core. He had never been so afraid. After what felt like a lifetime, a doctor finally approached. Sophie stood immediately, and Andrew was right beside her, his hands clenched into fists. The doctor smiled reassuringly. "The surgery was a success. Lily is stable and recovering well." Andrew let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Sophie's shoulders sagged in relief, and she covered her face with her hands for a moment before whispering, "Thank God." The doctor continued, "She'll be in recovery for a little while, but you can see her soon." Andrew barely heard the rest. All that mattered was that Lily was okay. When they were finally allowed into her room, Andrew felt his chest tighten again at the sight of her. She looked so small, so fragile, hooked up to machines, but she was breathing steadily. Her skin had more color than before, and her tiny hands rested on the blanket, peaceful in sleep. He sat down beside her, brushing his fingers lightly over her hand. Sophie sat on the other side of the bed, watching Lily with tired but relieved eyes. After a while, Lily's eyelashes fluttered, and her blue eyes slowly opened. She blinked up at them, then gave a small, sleepy smile. "Told you I'd be okay." Andrew let out a choked laugh, feeling something inside him break apart and put itself back together at the same time. He squeezed her hand gently. "Yeah, baby. You did." Lily yawned and looked up at him, her voice soft. "Can we go home soon?" Andrew felt something shift inside him at that word. Home, he had spent years thinking home was just a place, a luxury penthouse, a space filled with expensive furniture and nothing else. But sitting here, with his daughter looking up at him, waiting for an answer, he realized home wasn't a place at all. It was this. It was her. It was Sophie. It was something he had spent his whole life running from, only to realize it was all he had ever needed. He nodded, his voice steady. "Yeah, sweetheart. Soon." Sophie reached across the bed, resting a hand over Lily's. "We're going home together." Lily smiled, satisfied with that answer, and slowly drifted back to sleep. Andrew leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. The fear that had gripped him for days was still there, but it no longer controlled him. The past was behind them. The future was uncertain. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. This story is about redemption, the weight of lost time, and the power of second chances. Andrew Collins begins as a man who believes he has everything: wealth, control, and a carefully structured life. But when he learns that he has a daughter he never knew existed, everything shifts. He's forced to confront the fact that success means nothing if he has no one to share it with. What makes this journey so powerful is not just Andrew's transformation but also Sophie's struggle to trust him. She had every reason to believe he wouldn't stay, that he was still the man who once chose ambition over love. But through his actions, not just words, he proves that he's ready to be a father. Lily is the heart of the story, the innocent thread that ties them together. She doesn't hold on to the past the way adults do. She doesn't see Andrew as the man who wasn't there, she sees him as the father who is there now. And sometimes, love is that simple. The ending is satisfying because it doesn't rely on grand gestures or perfect resolutions. It's not about Andrew fixing everything overnight. It's about him choosing to stay, choosing to be a father, and proving through every small moment that he's not going anywhere. It's a reminder that while we can't rewrite the past, we can still show up for the future. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything.